So you have an interview coming up. Generally speaking, interviews can be a bit stressful. Every hiring manager has their own technique, their own list of questions they want to ask. And in the process of determining if you have the right skills, their ultimate goal is to figure out if you're actually a good fit for the company. No matter what tactic the interviewer takes, as long as you're confident in your skills, there shouldn't be too many questions that are going to stump you. Of course, the level of role you're applying for may require deeper understanding of Excel or other applications commonly used in the role. But regardless of the desired skill set, I think you'd be hard pressed to find a company that didn't expect you to know a little bit about Excel and its functionality. So instead of guessing what sort of questions might come up in your interview, let's focus more on the functions, tools, and processes that should make you feel more comfortable about your interview. First up, let's talk about cell references. Granted, in most interviews, I'd be surprised if they specifically ask you about cell references, but if you don't know what they are and how to manipulate them, it's an easy sign to the interviewer that you may be in over your head. So what is a cell reference? Cell reference is the location, also known as the address, of an active cell or cell being referred to in a formula. As you can see, my current cell is A3, which is showing Kelly in the formula bar. Here's our address, A3. Now, as it currently exists, this cell reference is a relative reference, meaning that the reference can change depending on other factors. So let's say in row 15, I'll enter a simple formula. I want 15 to copy A2, our relative reference. You can see Tobias. Now, this being a relative reference, the output will change as I move this formula. So if I were to drag this over, you can see that the relative reference changes with it. We have C2, D2, and so on. Same thing if I were to drag down. These are relative references. Now, if I were to change this to an absolute reference, which is signified by the dollar signs before the A column and the 2 row, now I could either enter the dollar signs or the shortcut key is F4, and it changes to an absolute reference. We still get Tobias, but if I move it, our cell reference never changes. Now we also have what's known as a mixed reference. So let's say we get rid of the dollar sign in front of row 2, but our column A is still locked. If I drag this over, we still have Tobias. If I drag it down, you can see that our cell reference only locked in column A, but the rows changed as the location of my formula changed. And this comes in handy when working with different functions and formulas that move around and are more dynamic, but you want either the row or the column to remain static. Here's another one that you shouldn't expect to be asked outright, but the order of operations is fundamental in constructing a properly run formula. Regarding the order of operations, you may remember the acronym from school PEMDAS, which is PEMDAS, standing for parentheses, exponents, multiplication, division, addition, and subtraction. And this is the order in which all of your functions will execute. For example, 2 plus 2 times 2 gives you an output of 6. However, using the order of operations, if I were to put parentheses around 2 plus 2, I'm telling Excel that I want 2 plus 2 to be determined first. Take that result, which is 4, and then multiply it by 2, giving us 8. Again, this isn't rocket science, but just something to keep in the back of your mind, or a little refresher from elementary school, because it will have an impact on your future formulas and functions. There's no shortage of benefits that conditional formatting offers you. Now, you don't have to be an Excel expert and understand every facet of conditional formatting, but you need to know how to set it up and customize it for your uses. Before we apply any conditional formatting, let's first determine what the goal for the current monthly units sold are, and we'll base that off the previous monthly units sold. So for instance, we'll take the previous monthly units sold, and let's say the manager wanted a 20% increase on those units. With a quick logical formula, we'll take the previous monthly units sold, times it by 0.12, which would give us a 20% increase. Now we can use conditional formatting to quickly point out who didn't meet their goal. So what I'll do is select the entire values of that column, go to the Home tab, Conditional Formatting, and you'll see here we can create a new role and customize it as we want, but Excel does give you some quick options here. Let's go ahead and create a new role. So you have options such as format all cells based on their values, on what they contain, their ranks, below or above average. Go with this last one here, and we'll use a formula to determine which cells to format. and you'll see it says format values where this formula is true. And the formula we want to be true would be C2. Now we want to make sure that's not an absolute reference. We want it to be a mixed reference. So the column C will be locked in, but the formatting will apply to the appropriate row as it's dragged down. So get rid of that $sign. We want C2 to be greater than or equal to G2, which is the goal. Again, change that reference to a mixed reference. Select format. Let's choose green. Select OK. Now we can see that only 3 rows met the current monthly goal or exceeded it. So Bob's goal was 10.8, came out with 17. Again, Kelly met it. And our new employee, John Cavanaugh, who started off with nothing last month, sold 7 units. Now there are other ways you can use conditional formatting. We could apply borders. We could change the font. There's really too many uses to list where conditional formatting is considered a benefit. Whether you're applying for a data analyst position or something completely separate from a technical role, identifying duplicates in a file is so important and something anyone in the business world should be able to perform. As I mentioned previously, conditional formatting has a lot of benefits, one of them being to locate duplicate values. So let's take our first name column, column A, go to conditional formatting, and this time under highlight cell rules, you'll see there's a duplicate values option. Go ahead and select that. You get this pop-up window giving you some customizations. So what we're looking for are duplicates, how we want them to be filled. We'll just go with the default, press OK. And you can see we have Kelly and Kelly, John and John. Now these do have different last names, so they're not true duplicates. If we wanted to remove our duplicates, we could go up to the Data tab, and you have a Remove Duplicates option. Now if I press this, it's going to ask me if I want to expand the selection, because as of right now, we're only looking at column A. And normally as a rule of thumb, I would expand this section to remove any rows that were truly duplicate, and Excel would look for where the entire row contents duplicated another row's contents. But there are none, so I'll just go ahead and hit cancel. You could also use a pivot table, which we'll get into later, to see the count of actually how many values you have for each row, whether you're looking at the first name, whether you're looking at the units sold, and so on. There are functions like COUNTIF, or you could use the old eyeball method and simply filter and sort your columns to find those duplicate values. So in this case, if I select anywhere in my table, press Ctrl A, highlight the whole thing, I could come right up here into this Data tab, select Filter, and now we have these little boxes here on the headers, allowing us to filter. And if I open up the first name, you could see sort A to Z, Z to A, sort by color. In this case, we'll do sort A to Z. And if this wasn't conditionally formatted, you would be able to see that you have 2 Johns and 2 Kellys. Now this is a relatively small table, so when working with larger data sets, this may not be the best option to use. Something like a pivot table, conditional formatting, or even a COUNTIF may be more beneficial. To wrap up our easy section of Excel interview skills, you should know how to protect or unprotect a worksheet. Now what does that mean? Let's say we wanted to send this file to a coworker, but we didn't want them to be able to change any of our conditional formatting or formulas. You can do that simply by locking the sheet or the workbook itself so that they can view the data, but no changes can be made. To do that, you would just go to the Review tab, and you'll see here, Protect Sheet, Protect Workbook. If you protect the workbook, it's going to protect all of my tabs. If you do Protect Sheet, we're allowing other users to make changes on our other tabs, but not this one. So if I select Protect Sheet, the first thing you see is a password. You can enter whatever password you want to lock this. So if you send it off, someone wants to make a change, and you determine that it's okay for them to make a change, you can give them the password. Or if you need to make any changes, you can just re-enter the password to unlock it. You'll see Protect Worksheet and Contents Lock Cells, and I'll show you how to adjust which cells can be locked in a moment. But you can also decide which functionality you want to lock. So right now we're allowing cells to be formatted, we're allowing someone to insert rows, we're allowing sort to be done, or to use a pivot table. But you can check these off to specify which functionality you want to be locked. In this case, for password, I will just set it as password, hit OK, re-enter password to proceed, and there you go. Now you can't tell, but I'm actually clicking on this filter to try to open it up under the previous month commission, and nothing's happening. That's because these cells are now locked. Now to unprotect the sheet, whether it's your own sheet or a sheet that someone sent you that has a password protection on it, again under the Review tab, you would do Unprotect Sheet. We'll enter our password, and now it's unlocked. If you wanted to further customize what is locked and what is not, let's say this cell we did not want to be locked, I could right click, go to our Format Cells, under Protection, you can see this locked here, I could just uncheck that. So even after I lock the sheet, that specific cell would be able to have changes performed on it. And the hidden option is good for formulas. If for whatever reason you didn't want someone to see the formulas you were using, whether it was to determine a bonus or some other private matter, you could select hidden so that when the sheet is protected and you send it off, those formulas aren't visible. A need-to-know skill in Excel, and the first that we'll consider a medium-level skill, is to split or extract text from a value, or specifically from an existing string or cell. This has numerous uses. There are many ways you can extract and split up data within Excel. You have the left, right, and mid function. There's newer formulas like text split, text before, and text after. You could even use the length function. And there is also a tool found in the ribbon that allows you to split text to columns. So let's look at some of these. We could use the left function. The left function is easy enough. For our text, we want to select our first cell. And the second argument asks us how many characters we want to pull from the left side. So if I said 4, closed it out, we've got Tish's first name. However, if I drag that down, we've only got the first 4 letters for each. Now you could further customize this and use a nested formula to search for that first blank space after the first name, and it would tell Excel to pull the entire first name ending at that blank space. The mid and right functions work just the same. We could also use the length function. And you see here by default, selecting the name just tells us that there's 10 characters in there, which doesn't do us a ton of good, but by integrating more functions, we can split the text in column A up. So this would be a good option to use along with the left function to determine the length before the first empty space. Now one of the newer functions, we have text split, text before and text after, but let's take a look at text split. For text split, first argument is our text. The column delimiter that we're going to look to split is that space between the first and last name. So within quotes, I'll just leave a blank space, close that off, hit enter, and we can see Tish Maxey. So we have our first and last name split out. If I drag that down, and it worked for all of them. Now how about text after? We have our email here, and let's say we just want the domain, whether it's Gmail, Hotmail, AOL, or what have you. If I come to our domain column, do text after, our delimiter is that @ symbol. Let's close it all first, hit enter, and we have gmail.com. And there's our remaining. Now we could also make this a nested function to just pull the name of the domain and not .com. So if I go back up, and in front of my text after function, I type text before. Our text would be our pre-existing function. The delimiter, within quotes, put .com. Close that out. Now we only have Gmail. Finally, let's take a look at our text to columns tool. So here we have an address for each name, and we want to split this up. We want to split it up by street, city, state, and zip code. Now we could use some of the other functions we've already used, but there is another way to do this. So if I go up to the Data tab in the ribbon, under Data Tools we have Text to Columns. If I select that, you see a preview of our data down here, and we have 2 options, delimited or fixed width. Obviously it's not a fixed width. All of these values in this cell are different lengths, so we'll go with delimited. Hit next, and now we get to choose which delimiter we want to use. You even have another option to specify, but in this case I'll select comma, and you see our preview here has split up the text exactly as we were expecting. Select next. Now it's asking us how we want the data to appear. You could leave it as general, but in situations when you're dealing with numbers, I like to go with text. If we had kept general, we're probably going to lose the 0 in front of the first zip code, but text should keep it. I'll select our zip code column, change that to text, and the destination is asking us where we want the values to be placed. By leaving as F2, it'll replace our current address field. But in this case, I want to see what we changed it from, so I'll change F2 to G2. Select Finish, and now you can see that our data has been split up, and there's no formulas taking its place. There are other options like Flash Fill that we could experiment with, and I'll leave a link in the card above. And while Flash Fill is pretty intuitive, it's not 100% accurate. The next tip I want to share with you is less about using Excel and more about your logical problem solving. Again, this will be dependent on the role that you're applying for, but there are a lot of administration roles and technical roles looking to dive into your basic math functions. One such example is figuring out the percent increase or decrease of a value. Often this is over a time period, so we may be comparing one month of data versus another. And the hiring manager will want to see how you can calculate change in production between the two periods. And this is just another way for you to exercise your knowledge of the order of operations we discussed earlier. To determine a percentage change, we take a new value, subtract it from the old value, and the result of that should be contained with parentheses, is then divided by the old value. Your end result is then multiplied by 100 to give you the exact percent change of your values. Now keep in mind, if the resulting output shows as a negative value, then you have a percentage increase. The third skill you should know when preparing for an Excel interview is how to clean and organize your data. Now, in some roles, this will be a task that you perform daily. However, if the job you're applying for is less so technically inclined, I still urge you to learn how to do this, at least on a basic level. Because whatever file you're going to look at, checking for errors, duplicates, or simply filtering and sorting the data to your liking could greatly improve your productivity. I'll put a link to some of my other videos that go more in depth on some of these, but tools like the trim function, find and replace, and even case-sensitive formulas like proper, upper, and lower go a long way in standardizing your data. And really, that's all it's about, standardization. Another good practice to prepare for your Excel interview is to be ready to expand on how you use Excel charts and which ones you find more beneficial for certain data sets. If this is a more technical role, like a business analyst or data analyst, you want to be able to expand on how you've used dashboards, created KPIs, or simply presenting data in a line chart when the passing of time comes into play. I'll go ahead and link a video in the card above where I walk you through exactly how to create a dashboard. And while you can get more advanced in exercises like these, based on my experience, I find it best to explain to the interviewer that the primary goal of creating a chart or dashboard is to keep it simple and know your audience. The last thing you want to do is to create something overcomplicated, and while it may be beautiful, it fails to relay the information to your stakeholders. The last medium level skill you should understand in Excel is to familiarize yourself with the common errors you will often see when working with data. Not just understanding them and knowing what they are, how to solve them. Now, the most common errors that I usually come across, and probably you as well, is the NA error, the value error, the div error, reference, name, num, null, and spill. Now, you may be familiar with a lot of these, and maybe all of them, but for those that aren't, here's a quick breakdown. The NA error is often found when the value is not available in a function or formula. For instance, using a VLOOKUP, which we will expand on later, if the value you're looking for is not in the table array, you'll often get an NA error, letting you know that it cannot be found. A value error is often referring to an incorrect data type, or an invalid argument in a formula. A div error is telling you that you're trying to divide a number or value by 0 or an empty cell. A reference error will occur when your formula is referencing an invalid cell reference, often because the original cell was deleted or moved. A name error is when there is unrecognized text in a formula, usually caused by some sort of misspelling of the function name or an undefined name range. Similar to that, the num error will usually occur when there's an invalid numeric value. And generally you'll see these when there are larger than normal numbers or unacceptable formats. A null error will often occur when there's an incorrect use of range operators, such as using a space instead of a comma between ranges. And a spill error is often seen when working with dynamic functions, and the resulting output will expand many columns or many rows, and there's some sort of value blocking the output from being placed. Sometimes these errors are self-explanatory and easily solved. Usually checking for typos or misused arguments are a quick way to solve your issue. But if you can't quite just figure it out, Excel does have a helpful tool to diagnose your error problem. For more information on that, feel free to check out the link in the card above. Finally, onto the harder skills that the average Excel user should familiarize yourself with whenever preparing for an Excel interview. First up, a VLOOKUP. VLOOKUP can be somewhat complicated if you aren't used to using it. And even after you learn it, it takes some getting used to. But essentially a VLOOKUP takes a value in our data and looks for a matching value in another set of data. And if it's found, you can specify a specific cell in that row to return. Now, sometimes you just want to pull in the matching value itself so you can see if there is a matching value. And other times you want to pull in a cell on that same row, just in a different column. So for this example, I have the same table that we had in our easy section, and we have everything exactly the same, except we're missing our previous month units sold. So let's pull that in with a VLOOKUP. Now, we could type this out manually. If we did, you would see we have the VLOOKUP, and within the parentheses, we have options for 4 arguments. Our lookup value, which would be the value we're going to use in this table to look up in another table. We have the table array, and that will be the table that we're looking in on the separate data set, including any columns that you want to be able to pull from. The column index number is where you specify which column you want to grab the data to return. Now, by default, the lookup value in the table array is column 1, regardless of the letter of the column, whether it's C, F, G, wherever the lookup value is, that's column 1. And as you count further to the right, you increase by a number. So column C would be 1, D would be 2, E would be 3, and so on. And finally, the range lookup, which is optional, that is where you would enter either true, false, or 1, 0. 1 being true, 0 being false. Generally, I always go with false. It gives you an exact match. This might make a little bit more sense if we actually put this into practice. So instead of typing it out, we use a function helper within Excel. So if I go up to the Formula tab, and under the Lookup and Reference option, you'll see here we have VLOOKUP. If I select that, it places the VLOOKUP in our cell, and this window is where we would select our lookup value in our current table. Now, as a tip, you want this value to be unique. You always want to choose a unique value as your lookup value, because if you remember previously, when we were showing duplicates, under the first name, there are 2 Kellys and 2 Johns. So if we use column A as our lookup value, we're probably not going to get the right result, because VLOOKUP will only pull the first instance in which it finds a match. It's not going to know that we've already pulled one for John, so go to the next one. It's going to pull that same value because it's going to look for John and it's going to pull the first instance. So in this case, we'll use column B, which is the last name, as they're all unique. So our lookup value, select B2, and we're not going to lock this in. This is going to be a relative reference. If we were to move the formula over to another cell, you might want to make it a mixed reference and lock in that column B, but for the rows, you want them to be able to flow to each other row. But for now, we'll leave it as is. For the table array, we want to choose the table from the original data set. So I'm going to go ahead and click this arrow to close that out. I go to our previous data set, and you can see in the functions argument, it's saying that we're in the Easy tab, which is good because it's going to reference that Easy tab in our function. Now the table array, again, the first column we choose will be 1. So we don't want to begin in the first name because that's not our lookup value. Your first column should always be where your lookup value exists, which is the last name. Now you could begin in the header, but it's not going to find a match. Either way, it won't make a difference. But in this case, I'll choose the first last name I see. We'll go all the way over to where the previous month sold is, and that's what we want to return. Drag that down so we cover the entirety of the data set within the values we want to look at. And you can see that little highlighted box in the bottom right hand corner here says 11R times 4C, saying there's 11 rows highlighted and 4 columns. And that's your little cheat sheet for the next argument, because we've gone 4 columns over, which will be our column index number. If I let go of the mouse, go ahead and select this box to open it back up. Now a tip here, you actually want to lock these in for the table array as an absolute reference because you don't want this moving. Because as your lookup value goes down from B2 to B3, if these aren't locked, your table array will move down as well. So you're going to miss some things. So the shortcut here is F4. I'll lock that in. And for a column index number, if you remember, our table array had 4 columns, and the last column we selected was the one we want to pull from, so we'll enter 4. Now I could have highlighted more columns than what I did. I could have gone further, but in that case you want to count how many columns from the first column you selected are the values you want to pull. But in this case it's 4. And for the range lookup, again, by default, I always choose false or 0, which you can see equals false. There aren't many instances I found where true would be very useful. So before I hit OK, You're seeing here that we're looking for Smithers in this column on this row, and then the function goes to our original data set, looks at this subset of data from B2 to E12, and you can see some of the values here listed. It's going to look for Smithers as a match. When it finds the match, it's going to go to the right 4 columns and return that result, which will be Smithers previous month units sold, which in this case you can see will equal 13. Select OK. Perfect. Now what about these others? You may have noticed that in our first argument, we didn't select a table array like we did here. We didn't highlight the whole column. Well, in this case, because this is a relative reference, as I drag this down, it changes for each. So we see B3, however, look between B2 and E12 of the first tab and pull the 4th column value over, and so on and so forth. And that's it. Now there are limitations to the VLOOKUP. While it is widely popular, VLOOKUP only works from left to right. So when I look in the original data set and I selected these columns, it takes our first column that we selected and can only look right. You cannot look left. You cannot look backwards. So it may take some manipulation of your data to find what you're looking for. However, there are other options like XLOOKUP, and I'll share a link in the card above, but XLOOKUP isn't as restricted as that. You can look left, right. There's a few more arguments that give you some more optionality. There's even something called a fuzzy lookup. But VLOOKUP, from my experience, is probably the most often used in the business world. However, XLOOKUP, in my opinion, is far superior. Again, this will depend on the type of role that you're applying for. But me personally, I don't think I've had a single interview where a VLOOKUP wasn't mentioned in one form or another. Here's a big one. Learning how to create and use pivot tables is essential in almost any industry. It's a great way to summarize your data without having to use complicated functions that you may not be familiar with. Now let's take our data and we want to create a pivot table. And a pivot table is great for summarizing your data, filtering it down with aggregations. You can create custom fields. Now there's not a ton of benefit for something this small, but for data that spans hundreds of rows, thousands or more, you can get a good look at the breakdown of your values, of the subtotals, the value counts. You can look at percentages. There's a lot of things you can do. But to create a pivot table, if I select anywhere in my data, press Ctrl A to highlight everything, and up here in the Insert tab, you'll see recommended pivot tables. But if you just go to pivot table, you'll see from table range or from external data source. You want to go with table range because that's what we have highlighted. You get this window that pops up showing you your existing selection. And then you can choose, do you want to add it to a new worksheet? Do you want to choose an existing worksheet? If you want an existing worksheet, you could just select the first cell of anywhere you want it to appear, and it would appear beginning in H2. You can add it to a data model. So if you have other data sources, let's say from previous months or other employees, and you want to add it to that, you could select that. In this case, we'll leave it blank. We'll keep it on a new worksheet, select OK, and this is what you'll see to begin with. Just this empty selection here. Now to the right, you see all our fields from our data. And you've got a filter option, your rows, your values, your columns. And let's say for our rows, we want to pull in last name. Now our pivot table is just showing the last name. We have a grand total row, but nothing showing because we don't have any values. We could take our commission and pull it into values. And by default, it takes the sum of the values. Now, if I were to click on that, you can go to value field settings. We could change sum to count, to average, max, min. We can show values as a percentage, a difference from. We can change the number format. We can even rename the sum of commission to something else. Now let's say we get rid of last name and instead pull in first name. Now you can see where our duplicates, John and Kelly, the commission is much higher because we have 2 examples of John and Kelly. So furthermore, I could take the first name again, drop it into our values, and you can see its count of first name. So it's telling you that there's 2 Johns and 2 Kellys. Again, another way to check for duplicates. Instead of count of first name, I could pull last name into the filters. And if I open up the filter, let's say we select multiple items, pull in Kavanaugh, select OK. And you can see John Kavanaugh has a commission of $3,636.63. We can even add in another filter, bring in first name. So if I remove this filter And now you'll see our sum of commission has everything. So we don't have any rows. This is just giving you a subtotal. Again, another way to summarize the data. But if we go to first name, let's say we want John again. It's giving us $8,106.04. If we go to last name, John Vickers. There is no John Vickers, so we get 0. Choose John Bellows. We can see John Bellows has a commission of $4,469.41. Again, we could further customize this, give it some formatting, change the font, what have you. If we were to make changes to our original data source, it does not automatically show in the pivot table, but in that case, we would just refresh our pivot table and we would get a different number if the values had changed. If more rows were added to our data, we may have to change the data source to include those rows. We would just select change data source and then add in those existing rows. You could furthermore change exactly how the pivot table is going to appear. You could change the colors, you could add banded rows. Let's say we move first name and last name down. Let's get rid of our filter. And we can see that John and Kelly have 2 entries underneath them. We could break this up a bit under report layout. We could show an outline form. We could show in a tabular form. We could get rid of grand totals or subtotals. For our blank rows, you have some functionality. If we go back under report layout, we can repeat all items. So now you can see that John is filled in next to Kavanaugh where it wasn't previously. The same with Kelly. So there's a lot you can do. And you don't have to be a wizard at this. It does take some getting used to. To know how to work around the pivot table will only help you during a job interview. If functions in themselves aren't too complicated. However, knowing how to use nested if functions is a great way to showcase your knowledge. Now let's work with some nested if functions. Obviously, if you're familiar with if functions, they're pretty logical. If this equals that, then do this. If not, you can specify another condition. But nested if functions allow you to break up those options a bit more. So if you have more than one condition you want to check, nested if functions are perfect in that case. So as a helper column to see what we're going to do here, I'll create a simple formula. I want to take the units sold in the current month and compare it to the units sold in the previous month. So I'll take the current month, subtract the previous month, drag that down. So now we can see the difference. Now for our nested if formula, we could use this column to base it off of. Let's pretend that's not there. So go with if the current month units sold minus the previous month units sold is greater than 5. So if that output in column G, if it's greater than 5, we want the output to be awesome. After a comma, this is where we would put the value when it is not true. So if it was 5 or under, or even a negative, we would just have one option. But in this case, we don't want that. So instead of putting our final value for the false, we'll start another if statement. So we'll do if minus E2 is greater than 1. We'll say good. Put a comma. Now I want to count for some other options. So we'll say, again, another if statement. If C2 minus E2, we'll say greater than 0. So it would have to be 1 as the value. Say not bad. So now if the value is 0 or a negative number, we could break that down even more. But for now, if it doesn't fit any of the other conditions, we'll just say keep trying. So now let's close that out, and that will take a few different closing parentheses. And as you can see here, we start with the highest number, and that does matter because if we were to work this in reverse, anything that was greater than 0 would come back as not bad. You wouldn't get good, you wouldn't get awesome. By doing it in this order, we're looking at our highest values first, anything greater than 5, and giving it awesome. So now anything below that, anything 5 or less, is being reevaluated with that second if statement. So let's go ahead and hit enter. We have good, this was a value of 2. If I drag that down, keep trying, these are negative numbers. 8 and 6 are awesome. Keep trying, and 7 was awesome. And that's just one example of a nested if function. Again, there's a lot of ways you can use this, but concerning the interview, it's just important you understand how that works. Specifically where the if goes, the order in that you put it in. As long as you can understand it when you see it or explain it, that's what counts. Finally, I suggest taking a little time to understand if-related functions like COUNTIF and SUMIF. These are great tools to use when you need to perform some sort of operation that rely on a condition being met. So there you have it. Those are all my suggestions of the things you should brush up on in Excel. Of course, there's really no way to know what is going to be asked in an interview, but generally speaking, most of what I talked about today will carry you a long way. If there's anything that I've gone over or something else you want me to expand on, drop a comment below and I'll be sure to cover it. And remember, before you start stressing out about not knowing every single one of these, over preparing can do more harm than good. So if you're feeling stressed out, just focus on a few and start there. A lot of these tools are often used together, so don't overwhelm yourself. Pick a few that relate to the job you're applying for and spend your time more wisely. Thanks for watching, and good luck on your interview.